My name is Sophie, and that is my dog. Odin is a pit bull that my family adopted from a rescue around 9 years ago now, in 2016. We got him when he was just a puppy. He had a bunch of wrinkles on his head, and he was so small and cute. Although pit bulls are permitted and are common in Canada, in the province that I'm from, they are actually banned in the UK, in London, where I'm living now. So Odin wouldn't even be allowed to visit me or to live here at all. This is due to the Dangerous Dogs Act 1991, which was introduced in the UK and bans all dogs of a certain breed, including pit bulls. The Dangerous Dogs Act is an example of breed-specific legislation, or a breed ban. Breed-specific legislation bans certain dogs based solely on their breed characteristics, so physical characteristics as to what they look like, their measurements, the shape of their head, the shape of their body, their build. Breed bans are often enacted because these dogs, including pit bulls, are portrayed as being inherently dangerous, as inherently wanting to bite people, to attack people, and to want to fight all the time. However, this kind of portrayal doesn't really capture who these dogs are, and certainly misunderstands them to a great extent. I know for me, at least, Odin is such a caring and sweet dog, and moreover, he's actually kind of a wimp most of the time. Therefore, in this video, I'm going to explore breed bans, breed-specific legislation, and the Dangerous Dogs Act in the UK, examining what are some concerns with this act, going on to consider criticisms and the practical effects of breed bans. Finally, I'll consider some more theoretical approaches and also what alternatives have been explored in other jurisdictions in other areas of the world where there are no breed bans on dogs. So let's go. The Dangerous Dogs Act in the UK was introduced in 1991 following a series of dog attacks on the public. Following these widely publicized attacks, a bill was passed through Parliament to ban certain types of breeds. Now, the entire legislative process, the entire creation of this law, including debate in the House of Commons, was completed in just 4 days, which is really kind of extraordinarily fast for any kind of legislation. Section 1 of the DDA sets out a prohibition on certain dog breeds bred for fighting, applying to pit bull terriers, Japanese Tosas, and any other type designated by the Secretary of State by the government. Indeed, just recently in 2023, the Secretary of State designated another breed, a third breed, that of XL bulldogs, as being a dangerous dog type under Section 1. Section 1 of the DDA prohibits ownership, breeding, selling, or exchanging or gifting of any of these types of dogs. The punishment for contravening this section, for going against this section, is imprisonment for a term of not exceeding 6 months, or alternatively a fine. If someone is guilty of this offense, of owning this dog or breeding or selling these types of dogs, Section 4 of the DDA sets out that the dog may be destroyed. Now, the legislation always uses the word destroyed in this area because dogs are actually legally property under English law, which means that as opposed to being put down or killed or using these kinds of words, the legislation uses the word destroyed. Therefore, Section 4 provides that dogs of these types can be destroyed based off of their height, their weight, or the shape of their skull. Now, there is an exemption scheme to the DDA. The Dangerous Dogs Exemption Scheme Order of 2015, which was again created by the Secretary of State, allows owners of banned breeds to apply for their dog to be exempted by paying an exemption fee. Owners of these banned breeds who still want to keep their dogs must keep their dog muzzled, on a leash in public, and must neuter and microchip them. However, although this exemption scheme may be seen to kind of reduce the harshness or reduce the intensity of the DDA and the strict outright ban that it provides, there are a lot of problems with the exemption scheme. The exemption scheme only allows dogs to change owners if their owner dies or is seriously ill. What that means is that if an owner simply doesn't want to have their dog anymore and they give them up to, for example, a rescue organization or something like that, the rescue organization is not legally allowed to rehome the dog. They can't have the dog adopted out to find a new loving home. This also applies to stray dogs or abandoned dogs or any other kind of rescues or fosters. It means that dogs coming into centers, rescue centers or rescue organizations can't be adopted out and can't be rehomed, and they will have to be put down. They will have to be destroyed. The consequences of this are pretty severe. A good example highlighting this is when the BBC in 2016 visited the Battersea Dogs and Cats Home. The Battersea Dogs and Cats Home is an animal rescue organization in Battersea in London. I also went there a few weeks ago and was really surprised by how large it is. Battersea is one of the UK's oldest and most well-known rescue centres and has been rehoming dogs and cats for over 150 years. The typical process for dogs that end up in Battersea, whether they're rescues or strays or fosters or simply being rehomed by their owners, is for the dogs to go through an assessment and then be adopted out to a new loving family who will hopefully take care of them very well. However, if a dog is assessed as having certain physical characteristics typical of a pit bull or another banned breed, they will be classified as a dangerous dog. And legally, Battersea is left with no choice but to put these dogs to sleep. As can be seen with the BBC, who visited Battersea in 2016 and met this dog called Caramel, who was potentially going to be classified as a pit bull because she met some of the physical characteristics of a pit bull type. Luckily, Caramel was not classified as such, but this video really highlights how arbitrary this legislation is. If she had been classified as a pit bull type dog, she would have been killed. This is despite her having a really nice temperament, being really polite and friendly with strangers even. On average, around 8 pit bulls per month are being put down at Battersea. A vet working at Battersea who has to carry out these operations pointed out that this really seems quite nonsensical. Yes, sometimes hard decisions need to be made in the veterinary practice. However, there seems to be no rational basis for putting these dogs down. It means that perfectly healthy and happy dogs are being put down just because they are identified as being a certain type. So, with this background in mind, let's dive into some criticisms of the Act. Firstly, a kind of preliminary criticism of the Dangerous Dogs Act is that it was really hastily prepared and passed. The very quick way in which the Act was passed demonstrates that there wasn't much thought behind the actual policy, that there wasn't much research going into what should be the best approach in response to these very serious dog attacks. Aside from this more preliminary criticism, breed bans in general can be criticized because they misunderstand dogs and dogs' behavior. In 2023, the UK Centre for Animal Law, which is a charity existing to promote knowledge and education about the law relating to animal protection, responded to the government's announcement that it intended to add the breed of XL bulldogs to the list of banned breeds under Section 1 of the DDA. The UK Centre for Animal Law stated that by focusing on breed as the only relevant factor, This policy ignores the potential of all dogs to demonstrate aggressive characteristics and fails to target the behavior of unscrupulous breeders and owners who can simply switch to other muscled and strong breed types not on the banned list. What the UK Centre for Animal Law is essentially saying here is that this type of legislation, this breed-specific legislation, portrays dogs of this type, pit bull dogs and other types, in a very specific way. The legislation perpetuates a characterization of these dogs as inherently dangerous, as being aggressive, unfriendly, dangerous, and essentially killer dogs. In doing the research for this video, I came across a Reddit post on essentially opinions about breed bans, and there was a comment on one of the posts that compared these types of dogs, particularly pit bulls, to guns. It said something along the lines of, a pit bull is like a gun, we must control it and ban it at all costs. It's just a weapon. A lot of this messaging is also wrapped up in the idea that this is naturally who pit bulls and other types of dogs are. That because they were initially especially bred for fighting and bred to be fighting dogs, that all that they know how to do is fight, all that they know how to do is be aggressive, and that these traits are really going to determine their entire behavior and affect their relationships with humans and other dogs. Not only is this kind of messaging very extreme, it is also flawed. The RSPCA, the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, which is the largest animal welfare charity in the UK, conducted a report in 2016 and concluded that there is no specific research to suggest that dogs selected for fighting are inherently aggressive or that they are unique in their bite style or ability to cause serious damage. The Centre for Animal Law further states that the problem is not necessarily with certain dog breeds, but with the breeding, training, and mutilation carried out deliberately to weaponize dogs. So, breed-specific legislation is underpinned by the idea that dogs bred for fighting are inherently more aggressive than other dogs, especially towards humans. However, this view is actually not supported by research and is not evidence-based. A study comparing pit bull terriers to other types of dogs found that in response to common stimuli and situations, pit bulls scored relatively average in demonstrating aggression to other dogs and actually below average in demonstrating aggression to owners. Relating this back to attacks and dog attacks on the public, this means that breed is actually not a good predictor of risk. A survey of 215 experienced dog behaviorists by Battersea Dogs and Cats Home found that 74% of these experts said that breed was not at all or just slightly important as a reason for why dogs attack people, and 86% said that how the dog is brought up by their owner was very important to determining if a dog will attack a person. This highlights that aggression in dogs is a very complex behavior, influenced by the individual dog themselves and their characteristics, as well as how they were bred, how they were trained, as well as their life experiences. The RSPCA report also stated that as a result of good breeding and good ownership, pit bull dogs and other types of dogs that are viewed as dangerous can actually be really friendly, sociable, and great family dogs. I know this from my own experience with Odin. He's been such a wonderful family dog, living with my family and other animals as well in the house. So more broadly, another criticism of the DDA and of breed bans in general is just that they're unfair. We saw the example of Battersea, where vets are having to put down perfectly healthy and happy dogs with good behavior. Even aside from potential death, the application of breed-specific legislation affects dogs' welfare. This is because dogs that are identified as potentially being a pit bull type are seized and kept in kennels for months or potentially years while they await prosecution or exemption. Finally, the DDA can be criticized because it is actually ineffective. The Center for Animal Law states that it has concerns that the DDA has failed to effectively tackle dog attacks. The RSPCA goes a bit further and states that breed-specific legislation has not reduced dog bites or protected public safety. As can be seen on this graph, there has been a steady increase over recent years in the number of dog bites in the UK, and this is following the DDA, which was passed in 1991. Therefore, it would seem that even apart from these welfare considerations of unfairness towards the dogs and arbitrary putting down of perfectly nice dogs, breed-specific legislation actually isn't effectively tackling dog attacks and is not an effective approach to reducing this huge public concern that we should be addressing. So, given that the legislation in this area is ineffective, unfair, and misunderstands dogs and dog behavior, what should be the approach? In the next two sections, I'm going to examine firstly some theoretical approaches as to what should be an alternative to just an outright ban on all dogs. And then finally, I'll look at some alternatives that have been explored in other jurisdictions to tackling dog attacks and to preventing this public concern. Taking a step back here and looking more broadly at humans' relationship with animals, there's kind of a light and a dark side to our relationship with them. Martha Nussbaum, who is an American philosopher and a professor of law and ethics at the University of Chicago, highlights the example of Argos, who was Odysseus's dog. In Homer's Odyssey, after Odysseus returns to Ithaca after nearly 25 years, he finds his beloved hunting dog, Argos, lying neglected on a heap of manure, his coat infested with ticks. Argos still recognizes him and wags his tail happily when he sees Odysseus. This example highlights how, on the one hand, we have these really intense and emotional connections with our pets and with dogs, and often we see them as members of the family. However, on the more darker side, dogs are really inherently vulnerable and dependent on us. This leaves them open to exploitation by negligent or cruel owners. Given this inherently vulnerable state and the fact that these animals, these dogs, are living and sentient creatures, we should focus on their needs and behaviors and allowing them to live their lives to the fullest in a dependent relationship with us, in this kind of symbiotic relationship. This idea is espoused by Martha Nussbaum, who I mentioned earlier as highlighting the example of Argos. Nussbaum advocates for a capabilities approach to animal protection. The capabilities approach asks us to respect the characteristic form of life of an animal and argues that we should not just prevent suffering to animals, but also allow them to flourish. This means that we should allow animals to live their best lives according to their needs and their behaviors. This approach is subjective and contextual. It focuses on the dog itself, on the individual dog, as opposed to a larger breed or a larger type of dog, as breed bans do. In this way, it's more nuanced, it's more contextual and flexible, as opposed to just an outright ban, which is very strict. Overall, Nussbaum argues that we should align our treatment of dogs with their subjective capabilities, so focusing on their behavior, their needs, and what we can do to ensure better behavior and non-aggression towards humans. Now, this is very theoretical, so taking a step back and looking at how this might actually play out in real life, we can look towards a series of court cases in Italy recently, which actually concerned custody over dogs after a couple has divorced. Paola Fossati of the Faculty of Veterinary Medicine at the University of the Studies of Milan, Italy, sets out these cases. In these cases, where a couple had divorced, the court had to decide who would get the dog. Instead of just viewing the dog as property, as most legislation does here in the UK and also internationally, the Civil Court of Rome in 2016 instead shifted the judgment towards focusing on the perspective of the dog. This kind of approach, as highlighted by Fossati, mirrors how courts approach child custody cases by focusing on the point of view of the child. In this way, we can look to the actual needs of the dog and recognize the importance of protection of animals as sentient beings. A similar approach could be applied to dog aggression and to dog attacks. As with Caramel, who came into the Battersea Dogs and Cats home, instead of looking at her physical characteristics, we could instead look at her behavior and her needs and determine based off of that whether she was actually a danger to the public. Based on these behavioral characteristics as opposed to physical characteristics, we could actually examine what Caramel needs, what kind of training she needs, what kind of owner she needs, and what we could do to help minimize the risk of a public attack. This kind of subjective process, focusing on the individual dog, could be institutionalized on a wider scale. Christine Korsgaard, an American philosopher and professor of philosophy at Harvard University, advocates for this approach. Korsgaard recognizes how completely dependent pets are on us and argues that we should ensure they are cared for through our social services to a greater extent than they are now. This would be the kind of work that private organizations are already carrying out, but would be institutionalized and formalized on a larger scale to ensure greater protection. So, that was a lot of theory. On from all this theory, how could these kind of theoretical approaches actually play out in real life? Given the criticisms and given the theoretical concerns with breed-specific legislation, we need to ensure an evidence-based approach to both protection of the dogs and the public when it comes to dog attacks. A case study for this kind of effective approach can be seen in the city of Calgary in Canada. In Canada, there is no nationwide ban, as there is in the UK, on specific breeds. However, BSL has been enacted in certain provinces and municipalities, notably in the province of Ontario. Calgary, by contrast, has not enacted any breed ban, and instead, citywide bylaws focus on responsible pet ownership. Under these bylaws, all dogs and cats must be licensed, and revenue raised by licensing is directed to programs promoting dog safety, public awareness, and education. The results from this approach are encouraging. Specifically, despite an increase in Calgary's population from 1985 to 2008, the number of dog bites actually decreased. The Montreal Gazette in 2016 stated that forcing responsibility onto owners, educating the public on the importance of quickly dealing with problem dogs, and ensuring pets are licensed led to a precipitous drop in the number of aggressive incidents. Now, quickly dealing with problem dogs does not sound encouraging. It actually sounds more like a breed ban kind of situation. However, I do think that the approach in Calgary is very much based on the behavior and needs of dogs, and that it's certainly not an outright ban based solely on physical characteristics. In this way, this kind of approach is actually really encouraging. It shows that by focusing on responsible ownership from owners, by focusing on the behavior of the dog and the individual dog and their needs, we can ensure actually a safer society with less dog attacks and also more fairness towards dogs. So, to conclude, I just want to come back to Onan again. Because I love him. But yeah, I think that there's a lot of misconception about the types of dogs that we're dealing with here. There's a lot of viewing them as monsters or inherently dangerous dogs, when in fact the reality is much more nuanced and not really as clear cut as that. These dogs exhibit all the same behaviors as other dogs do, and they certainly care deeply for humans and for other animals as well. At the same time, I think it is also important to have an effective approach to understanding dog attacks, to why they happen and how we can prevent them. However, blatantly banning certain breeds and solely blaming these types of dogs as being inherently aggressive not only misunderstands these dogs, but also doesn't actually tackle the root cause of dog attacks. By looking and by focusing more on dog behavior and on ownership and breeding, we can see that a more contextual, more subjective approach would actually lead to better results on the whole, both for dogs and for the public. Given this, we should strive to create a system which is evidence-based, effective, and provides adequate protection for these sweet, goofy, caring, and not so dangerous dogs. Yeah, so thanks so much for listening, and let me know any thoughts that you have on breed bans, on the DDA 1991, or any alternative approaches that could be useful for addressing dog attacks, but also promoting dog protection. Thanks so much for listening, and if you have a dog, go give them a hug.